Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Clark, Stims. Steep Stims, that's a T, fuck it. I keep misreading that. Okay, here we go, new Clark project. I'll always be game for a new full-length album from this long-running IDM producer and Warp Records regular, since even if the guy does have a particular sound to his productions that one can recognize from a distance, which tends to focus on fairly flashy and bombastic synth arrangements, taking experimental sound design and presenting it in more accessible structures. All of his projects seem to delve into different territory, and he's made sure you never quite know what to expect out of any new project of his. He's made percussion-heavy workouts like Turning Dragon, jazzier downtempo influenced stuff like Body Riddle, combining electronic and indie folk on Iradelphic, 2 modern classical albums, and Kiri variations and Playground in a Lake. And in fact, we most recently came off the heels of one of his odder experiments called Sus Dog, which was his attempt to try out singing himself and incorporating his own vocals with clear inspiration from as well as direct collaboration with Thom Yorke. Now, I enjoyed that album at the time, related to its existence as someone else who has also made exactly one album attempting to incorporate my own vocals and made it kind of like a loose meta statement around personal discomfort and insecurity. Though I wasn't exactly like head over heels in love with it either, and I'd be lying if I said I felt compelled to come back to that album since I covered it. And yeah, part of that is stemmed from my more recent lack of enthusiasm for hearing like anything Thom Yorke or Radiohead related, out of frustration with their politics and general attitude feeling more empty and pretentious to me now. For more of my feelings in that regard, you can just copy-paste what I said in the Kelly Lee Owen segment of the 10 more albums I changed my mind on video I did on earlier this year. I'm also not holding, like, anyone who works with Thom Yorke, like, against them, so whatever. But putting that whole conversation aside for the sake of not getting too sidetracked, Sus Dog wasn't really an album that stuck in my memory much, and I felt like it kind of disappeared from the conversation shortly after its release. At the time, I said it at best felt like it would be either a transitional effort for him to possibly try and improve upon next time, or a one-off detour, which was interesting that it existed and made Clark feel all the more versatile, but not necessarily be one of his more essential efforts overall. Anyway, 2 years later, we got his follow-up, and it seems like he's gone with the latter road and left Sus Dog to just be a one-off. Unless you count that Cave Dog companion album of, like, loose reworks and leftovers he originally started making for, like, his social media promos leading up to the main album. And that was neat, too, but I didn't feel like that would have counted as anything but, like, a bonus side thing not designed to stand on its own. And I opted not to cover that as a result. But anyway, this proper new album, his, I think, 12th to date by my count, this shows him returning to the purely electronic roots of his sound and making an album of synth love and drum machine love for your enjoyment. Basically, this shows him returning specifically to my personal favorite era of his discography when he released his self-titled album in Death Peak, sticking to just the core of what I expect out of his specific sound without really giving it any new or novel twist. As a direct contrast to Sus Dog putting him more out of his comfort zone than ever before, this album is maybe the safest he's ever played things before. Like, the average of what I would imagine a new Clark album in 2025 would sound like. Which I'm obviously all for. We know Death Peak is my favorite Clark album, and more stuff that sounds kinda like that can only be a good thing in my eyes. Just, you know, it's not gonna have the mind-blowing novelty to it that Death Peak and his self-titled did back in the day when I first got into his work. This, by comparison, feels like Clark just wanted to, like, take it easier with this one and not challenge himself quite so much. And he still delivered a really fun roller coaster ride of a record here anyway, so yeah. I will say this album does take a bit to, like, really get going for me. The album opens with a mostly ambient intro, Gift and Wound, that has a lot of synth arpeggios that get quite dramatic and propulsive in certain moments. And then we move into the functional opener, Infinite Roller, which is kind of like this loosely foreboding, dreamlike, arpeggio-driven house cut that, to be fair, is definitely a grower for me with more repeat listens. Getting more mysterious and well-layered, and there being a lot of rumbling and wobbling bass stabs. Though it is still fairly understated for the most part. Not exactly the massive attention grabber to start us out that something like for example, Butterfly Prowler was back in the day. And I have similar feelings on the track Janus Modal. While the way this track plays off the preceding synth interlude No Pills You and segues out of it is pretty neat, and the lighter and fluffier house progressions the track goes on are decently immersive for what they are. It's not exactly the kind of track where Clark is like bringing his own unique voice to this kind of sound. This track could have just as easily made sense coming out of an artist like John Hopkins, for instance, and I don't think people would have blinked at it. So, yeah, bit of an unassuming opening stretch, though I feel like the album really starts to get going for me after this point. There's another interlude called 18 EDO Bailiff, where, as per the title, Clark is playing on like a microtonally tuned piano for a bit. And that segues directly into a whole run of tracks which get much higher energy and more exciting, and all directly connect to each other and build off each other's ideas. Starting with what is most likely my favorite cut on the album in Globecore Flats. This track takes the microtonal piano riffs from that interlude and turns them into this big epic jungle drum and bass number that combines the usual blends of breakbeats you'd expect out of this genre with all this super heavy growling bass. A way heavier and more propulsive banger than anything else that showed up on the album previously, also with some cool change-ups that feature all these cinematic ambient pads near the end. Blowtorch Thimble picks directly where the previous track left off, so seamlessly I often don't even notice it's a new track at all sometimes, but combines the same breakbeat blends with new fuzzed out rave E arpeggios and acid breakdowns, with new melodies that work off the surrounding tracks really well. Then we move into Civilians, which keeps the train running with a more sparse and jittery but equally propulsive mix of simple but hard-hitting beats, bass, and strange squawking effects that kinda not quite resemble flutes or something. Really simplistic blend of sounds, but the groove is super tight and fits just as well into its surrounding tracks. And next we get my second favorite track on the album, Inpatient's Day Out, which keeps moving at the same pace as the last three tracks and has a similar simple but tight beat as Civilians, but builds on all these much more light and pleasant synth melodies that get quite layered and dreamlike alongside maybe some other light bell textures in the background, and make for one of the album's strongest emotional notes. Also, the whole outro with all these garbled, somewhat like, I guess, Oudiker Oversteps-esque synth riffs is pretty cool too. This track may have all the same sonic ingredients and general tone as Janus Modal earlier on the album, but I feel like it's assembled in such a way that feels much more uniquely like Clark's production and captured my attention much more effectively. Finally, this whole most propulsive stretch of the album culminates in Who Booed the Goose, a track that sort of mirrors the album intro, but it does the idea better in the way, like, it's also entirely made out of dramatic and heavy synth arpeggios, but build up to pretty impressive and attention-grabbing heights without any beats. Now, the very end of the album does lose a bit more steam. I feel like there's one last highlight in penultimate track Negation Loop, which combines more heavy dramatic arpeggios with some mysterious and haunting inclusions of vocals. Kind of vaguely reminds me of old tracks of his like Catastrophe Anthem, and does get quite intense in a cool way. Though the minute-long ambient interlude 5 millionth cave painting that comes before it isn't anything to write home about, and the album's closer, Microlith, makes for a bit of an anticlimax finish in comparison, as the synth arpeggios, while as dramatic and Clark-ish as ever, just kinda like slow down and sputter out into some barely audible bass rumbling and almost like 30 seconds of silence at the very end. Not exactly finishing with a bang there. I mean, maybe if those last three tracks had all been treated as one track, it might have worked in like a sort of epic prog adjacent manner, but with them separated, I do notice that only one of those three really grabs me and the other two are just kind of limp and whatever in greater context, so... yeah, that's everything on Steep Stims. Fuck. So yeah, that's everything on Steep Stims. It's definitely another Clark album, and I definitely had fun with it. Obviously not without its flaws. It is unfortunately very much a middle-loaded experience, and the very beginning and end are the least interesting parts for me. Not to mention, as someone who tends to be excited by new Clark albums thanks to his continually trying new things and pushing the envelope for himself, this isn't anything I haven't heard from him before. Maybe there's some like retro 90s dance throwback flavors to this one which aren't present on other albums of his, although that's that's not exactly special either, given it feels like 90s dance revivalism has been like the biggest overtone of like all new electronic music coming out in the 2020s. But that obviously doesn't mean Clark can't bring his own spin to that sound that he can call his own, and minor structural issues aside, that whole run from, I want to say, 18 EDO Bailiff through to Who Booed the Goose, that was legit great, and it made the album easily worth hearing on its own. So, I don't know, take that all as you will. I don't think this is gonna be, like, changing anyone's life, and I wouldn't be surprised if, like, for instance, whatever One of Tricks Point Never puts out later this year ends up making this borderline redundant. We'll see how that goes. But I think this is another very solid effort from him, as worth hearing as anything else in his catalog, and I definitely enjoyed my time with this one more than I did with his last album, so yeah, I think I can let this off with a very light 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.